Are the slides up? Oh, I see the slides up there. Okay, good. Yeah, that's better. And I guess I just say forward on the slides. Okay, I'm very brief because I just have a couple of minutes. As you said, I'm going to try and cover a very, very broad topic that requires far more discussion than I'm going to give it, but I will follow it up. And talking about how to estimate premature deaths from long-term exposure to PM2.5. So next slide. Okay, so this is like so many other environmental and pollution studies, that there are basically three groups of information: animal studies, controlled exposure studies, and then occupational studies, people who work and get exposed, and then epidemiological studies, where you look at populations, large populations. And that's really what we've been discussing this morning, are the population studies. And there's information that can be gotten from each of them, and there are strengths and weaknesses. And in one line, I tried to summarize these, so it's obviously very abbreviated. But in the animal studies, the big advantage is it's controlled conditions, and you can use specific pollution emissions to expose the animals, like mice, and then you can see what the effects of specific things are. The challenge in other situations is that there's a mix, and you can't, it's difficult to break out how much is from each component. Here you can apply a component, you can add things in, subtract them. So there are advantages to these kinds of studies, especially in looking at mechanisms. Is it biologically plausible that some component could have an effect on living things? The disadvantage is that you're giving up the realistic mix of pollution, that in reality people aren't exposed to just one pollutant, they're exposed to a variety of things. And also there's a species extrapolation required. In other words, people are not the same as mice, and there's a lot of differences, and so you have this whole problem of extrapolating, especially in terms of trying to get a dose response, how much pollution for how much effect. So quantitatively, you really can't use these studies for risk assessment, but you can use them as a way to look at biological plausibility. Then there are occupational studies, for example, toll workers who get exposed to air pollution and predominantly traffic pollution. And the advantage is that they're human populations with real pollution mixes, not just one pollutant. But the disadvantage is that they're very high exposure, so they're not like the general public. And also there's generally, anytime you look at an occupational group, you have to worry about, are they different from the general public? Is there a selection bias that goes on? That the type of people who get those jobs and keep those jobs might be different from the general public, and you probably don't have the most susceptible individuals in that population. And so when we talk about occupation, one of the big concerns people have is there a healthy worker effect? So that makes them not representative. So basically the concern would be that they're getting very high exposures, but then they have lower effects per microgram, so then you end up with very low estimates of effects. The epidemiological studies have advantages. I mean, those are real people getting real exposures, and it includes everybody in the population, including who might be susceptible in the population. And so that would be like people with pre-existing disease, older children, pregnant women, those populations. But the disadvantage is that then it's hard to differentiate out what component, how much is from one component, for example, diesel, versus another component, say oil burning. And so that's the challenge. Okay, next slide. So of the epidemiological studies, I've broken into three groups. One is proximity to roadway studies, and the advantages of that, again, they're real people, and they have large traffic exposures. I think in Europe it's more of a diesel exposure, but in the United States it's more of a mix. The disadvantages of those is, again, how much is diesel and how much is other traffic pollution if you find an effect. There's always a concern, well, in all studies really, possible socioeconomic status. The people who live near the roadways, in the case of the study, are they the same as the people who live further away? There's a really nice summary of all this. There's a recent, just last month, an HEI report, Special Report 17, that goes through all these studies. So that's worth looking at, and I think should get into the process. Maybe Dan will want to maybe summarize the findings of that, or if you want to add to it, or Aaron, you could assign it to Aaron. Yeah, it's 500 pages. Well, with 2 slides. Here we go. But basically in that report, if I can try and summarize it, even though I'm not the expert on that report, it seemed to me what they were saying with the long-term studies was that the results of looking at proximity to the roadway were consistent with studies of air pollution in general, but there just weren't enough studies that have been done where they took long-term cohorts and analyzed this to be able to come to some decision about causality. And so, and correct me if I'm wrong. But so that's a very relevant report to look at, Special Report 17, I think it is. Then epidemiology studies looking at particulate matter. We've been talking about those all day with their relative risks or hazard ratios. And the advantage of those, we do have many studies, and we have representative exposures and the general public that's that's studied. And so they're very relevant, but the disadvantage is if you're trying to apply this to diesel, that you're assuming that the toxicity of diesel is not significantly different from all particles. In other words, that you're saying we can't really say whether diesels are more or less toxic than PM2.5, so we're going to say that it's similar to other PM2.5 and treat it that way if you're going to use particulate matter studies. Now there's another option, which is epidemiological studies looking at the particulate matter components. Such as, by constituent, a trace element, or even doing source apportionment, where you take the mass and you apportion some of it to coal burning and some to traffic and some. And there are studies like that beginning to come out, but it's in a very early stage. And so while it has the advantage that it would yield results, of mass, deaths per amount of mass, let's say, or a relative risk that's more specific to traffic and to diesel, the disadvantage is we don't really have that many studies yet. So it's not really possible to have a body of knowledge to come to that estimate yet. And I think the basic, situation with that whole the whole area is that Mary Ross was really speaking to this morning, is that we don't have enough information to say that one component is much more toxic than another component yet, and that one thing is very much more and that one's very much less. And right now we can't answer that question with sufficient confidence. So I would say, based on our studies, it does seem that the fossil fuel combustion component, the kind of things that Art and Pope were talking about, the fossil fuel combustion component would be among the more toxic. But I think a conservative assumption is to just say, okay, we're not going to say it's the most toxic. We're going to say it's similar to other PM2.5. And so that would be, while not the best answer, I would love to have more studies done of components. I think that's a conservative approach to that. But so that's it, and so maybe that'll get some discussion going. Something to shoot at.